My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 38 years old. And if you've ever been told that family means belonging, let me tell you, sometimes family is the place where you feel most forgotten. That morning, I stepped into the Quinlan estate, into a dining room that smelled of polished wood and lemon oil. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling like a golden river across the long oak table. Every seat sparkled in its glow, each one marked by a crisp nameplate. Valora, Lucas, Uncle Douglas, even distant cousins I barely remembered. I searched for mine. There wasn't one. At the far end of the room where the light faded into shadow, sat a single chair, no arms, no cushion. In front of it, a plain white card, blank. I ran my hand across its empty surface. For a moment, it felt more honest than anything else in that room. Then my sister Valora, dressed in her cream blazer and a smile polished sharp enough to cut glass, raised her voice, and of course, Evelyn is here with us today, to observe. Not to lead, not to contribute. To observe. The word struck harder than a slap. I looked toward my parents, my mother folding her hands like she was praying for silence, my father clearing his throat but offering nothing. Their silence was the approval my sister needed. Do you know what silence feels like when it comes from the very people who raised you? It doesn't echo. It sinks, like a stone disappearing into water. That morning, I sank with it, and maybe, just maybe, you know that feeling too. Maybe you've been left out of a story that should have carried your name. Maybe you've been the one asked to stay quiet, to let others shine, even when your own light was burning. If you've ever felt that, then you already understand me. That's why I ask you to stay here with me. Like this video, subscribe if you wish. Not for the numbers, but because these are the family stories that remind us we are not alone in that silence. I sat down in the nameless chair, folding my hands to keep them from trembling. They thought they had erased me with a missing card and a single word, but beneath my stillness, something stirred. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, but far stronger. A storm was gathering inside me. I sat in that nameless chair pretending to steady my breath. On the outside I was calm, but inside, old wounds stirred awake, as if that blank card in front of me had ripped the bandage off years of silence. It wasn't the first time I'd been placed at the edge of a table. I remember Sunday dinners in our modest home, long before this estate, when the table was smaller, but the rules were the same. Valora sat close to Father, glowing under the weight of his approval. Lucas always had a story to tell, a grand idea that made the room laugh, even if the idea was foolish, even if it would crumble weeks later. And me? I was always at the far end, near the kitchen door. My place wasn't to be heard, it was to serve. When dishes piled high, Mother's voice carried down the table with gentle authority. Evelyn, bring more plates. Evelyn, don't interrupt your sister. Evelyn, let your brother finish. Her words were wrapped in softness, but they pressed me into silence all the same. My mother believed peace was more important than fairness, and so I learned to swallow my thoughts to keep her peace intact. Father never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His approval was currency, and he spent it freely on Valora and Lucas. With them, he was generous. With me, he was polite. A pat on the hand, a dismissive smile. You're a dreamer, Evelyn. That's fine for hobbies, but this family needs serious people. It was never anger that shaped me. It was indifference. And indifference, I discovered, cuts deeper than cruelty. There's one memory I can't seem to shake. I was 12 when Valora was preparing for a school dance. Her tiara wouldn't sit right, and she wept as though the world were ending. Mother rushed to soothe her. Father offered reassurances. And me? I found a handful of pins, adjusted the tiara, and secured it in place. She looked in the mirror, smiled, and ran off to show everyone. No one knew my hands had stopped her tears. No one remembered I had been there. Later that night, when my parents toasted Valora's beauty at the dinner table, my fingers were still sore from holding those pins. That was my role, invisible hands holding everything together. By the time I was old enough to offer ideas of my own, the pattern was set. I once suggested that Father reconsider pouring his savings into a failing restaurant chain. He barely looked up from his coffee, smiling that tight-lipped smile of his. "That's grown-up territory, honey." I was 23, old enough to sign contracts, old enough to pay bills. But in his eyes, I was still the girl at the end of the table carrying plates. So I learned to keep quiet, not because I lacked ideas, but because I knew their cost. That silence followed me into adulthood like a shadow stitched to my heels, even when I began building something of my own, something real, something powerful. I carried their voices with me, too blunt, too curious, too much. And now, sitting in this meeting, staring at the empty card in front of me, it all came rushing back. It wasn't about this single day. It was the sum of years, every dismissal, every silence, every time my worth was measured only by how well I could disappear. They thought they had trained me to stay small. They believed that no matter how much I grew, I would always sit quietly in the shadows, grateful just to be present. But they were wrong. In the silence, I had been watching. In the shadows, I had been building. And as I sat at the edge of that table once again, I knew this story wasn't ending the way they thought it would. The longer I sat there at that table, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just about the chair at the edge or the blank card in front of me. It was about history repeating itself. Once again, I was present but unseen. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. Papers shuffled across the polished wood. Valora stood taller, her cream blazer sharp against the sunlight. "As we move forward," she announced, "we'll be reviewing the updated structure of family assets and long-term planning." Updated structure, long-term planning. Her words felt polished, but beneath them I sensed the edge of something sharper. Folders were passed around. I received mine last. The stack in front of me was thinner, less deliberate, as if it had been thrown together at the last moment. I opened it slowly, trying to steady my hands. Inside were flowcharts, financial statements, and trust outlines. I scanned each page, searching for the place where my name should have been. A role, a mention, a contribution. There was nothing. Page after page, my name was absent. Projects I had once offered freely, my logistics systems, the technology that had saved them countless dollars, were listed under Family Collaborative Ventures. My contribution had been erased, my existence reduced to a silent footnote that wasn't even printed. My heart pounded as I turned to the section marked Inheritance and Future Holdings. There it was in black and white. Lucas and Valora were named as primary beneficiaries. My parents' signatures sat at the bottom of the page. My name wasn't missing by accident. It had been deliberately removed. I blinked, the room spinning for a moment. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like someone had pulled the floor away while expecting me to keep standing. I looked up just once, hoping to catch someone's eye. Father was staring at the table, as if the grain of the wood was suddenly more fascinating than his eldest daughter's erasure. Mother's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes never lifted from her folded notes. Lucas leaned back in his chair, grinning sheepishly. The picture of a man too pleased with his role to notice the woman who had once saved him from ruin. Because I had. 2 years earlier, Lucas's company had been collapsing under debt. Quietly, without acknowledgement, I wired $2 million from my own reserves into a shell account that saved his venture from immediate bankruptcy. He had called it a miracle. The family believed in his brilliance. They toasted his resilience. No one asked where the miracle had come from. And I had let them believe the lie, because I thought silence would keep the peace. But as I sat there now, watching Lucas bask in a glory built on money he didn't know was mine, I felt the sting of my own complicity. My silence had given them permission to erase me. Valora's voice carried across the room, smooth and calculated. "We want to thank everyone for their contributions. Each of you has played a vital role in shaping the direction of our legacy." Her eyes skimmed over me like a stone skipping water, never lingering long enough to leave a ripple. "And Evelyn," she added lightly, "we're glad you could be here to witness it." Witness it, as though my only role was to watch the life I built handed to someone else. I felt the paper tremble in my hands. I closed the folder slowly, forcing my breath to steady. The room buzzed with polite chatter, cousins nodding along, uncles whispering approvals. No one questioned why my name was missing. No one asked why my voice was silent. I excused myself quietly, walking toward the hallway lined with portraits of smiling faces. Generations framed in gold, each portrait painted to capture pride and belonging. I stared at them as I passed, wondering if any of those faces had ever felt what I felt now, being cut away like a diseased branch from a family tree. Inside the powder room, I locked the door and leaned against the marble sink. My reflection stared back at me, pale but steady. I pulled a manila folder from my bag, its cover marked in thick black ink, in case of war. Inside were legal documents, ownership claims, transaction receipts, proof that I had been more than a ghost in this family. I had the receipts of every wire transfer, every bailout, every idea stolen. My hands lingered on the papers, but I didn't pull them out. Not yet. Because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. It wasn't just that they ignored me. It wasn't just that they dismissed me. They had rewritten the story, ripped my chapter out of the book, and carried on as though I had never existed. And the cruelest part? They expected me to smile through it. I placed the folder back into my bag and returned to the table. My seat waited for me, nameless and hollow, but I sat down with my head held higher than before. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would accept being erased. But silence, I realized, was no longer protection. It was surrender. And I was done surrendering. I sat back down at that table, the folder closed but the truth of it burning hot in my chest. They had erased me from the pages of their story, yet expected me to nod politely as if my absence were natural. I folded my hands to still the tremor in them, trying not to let the room see the storm that had begun to rise inside me. And then came the next act of betrayal. Valora cleared her throat, her voice smooth as silk. Now, I'd like to introduce someone who has been instrumental in guiding our family toward its future. Please welcome our strategic consultant, Kayla. For a heartbeat, I thought I had misheard. The name echoed in my ears, pulling me backward through the years. Kayla, my Kayla. She walked into the room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she belonged. A sleek pantsuit, hair pinned in the same neat bun she wore the last time she worked for me. I remembered the day I had hired her, a nervous graduate clutching her resume, eager to prove herself. I had given her a chance when no one else would. I had mentored her, taught her to see beyond the numbers, to find rhythm in logistics and possibility in planning. And now, here she was, standing at my family's table, at my sister's side. Her voice shook at first, just slightly, before finding its rhythm. She clicked through slides on the projector, each one displaying charts, graphs, and diagrams. My diagrams, my systems, my work. I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it. The software flowcharts, the adaptive inventory modules, the interface logic, they were mine. I had sketched them on scraps of paper in a Denver apartment 8 years ago. I had built them line by line, sleepless night by sleepless night. And here, they had been scrubbed clean of my name and dressed in new colors, rebranded as Quinlan Future Holdings. The family leaned in, nodding, impressed. Valora clapped first, and the room followed, their polite applause echoing like hammers inside my skull. Kayla ended her presentation with a line that nearly made me laugh out loud in disbelief. "Efficiency isn't about speed," she said, her tone steady. "It's about invisibility." I froze. That was my phrase, a sentence I had once scribbled on a sticky note and pinned to her desk years ago when she was still learning what efficiency meant. Now she stood there repeating it like it was hers, and the family applauded as if it were gospel. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. A theft so deliberate, so personal, it twisted deep into my chest. I looked around the table. No one seemed to notice the resemblance between what she presented and what I had built, or maybe they did, and chose not to care. To them, the brilliance wasn't important. It was the branding, the story, the performance. My gaze landed on Valora. She smiled, tight and triumphant, as though she knew exactly what she had done, as though every omission, every erasure, every theft had been planned, and now she had my former protégé standing beside her as proof that I was replaceable. My mother dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, unbothered. My father adjusted his cufflinks, more concerned with appearance than integrity. Lucas leaned in to whisper to an uncle, already talking about the exciting new direction. Not one of them flinched. Not one of them spoke my name. The betrayal doubled, layered on itself. Blood and loyalty both broken. I thought back to those nights when Kayla and I sat hunched over spreadsheets, eating takeout at midnight. I remembered her calling me the only boss who ever believed in me. And now here she was, polished and practiced, selling my life work to the very people who had worked tirelessly to erase me. The knife wasn't just in my back, it was in my chest, twisted by the hands of someone I had trusted. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of the folder pressing against my lap. My fingers itched to open it, to scatter the receipts across the table, to let the truth burn through their performance. But I held still. Not yet. Because I had learned something in the years they spent teaching me silence. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. And then it strikes with precision. I slipped my phone from my bag, my fingers steady now. Beneath the table, I opened a secure app and typed a brief message to my attorney. Subject: Clause C body, trigger full lock. Include IP protection. Quiet mode, timestamp everything. I pressed send. No one noticed. The applause still lingered in the air, Kayla still smiling as though she had earned every word she spoke. I looked at her one last time. Not with anger. Not even with grief. But with clarity. The family believed they had stripped me of everything. My name, my place, my voice. Kayla believed she had sold her loyalty for a brighter stage. But what they didn't know was this. I wasn't the ghost in the room. I was the storm gathering just beyond its walls. The room was still buzzing from Kayla's presentation when I felt the weight of my own silence pressing against me. My family applauded theft wrapped in polite smiles, and I sat there, outwardly calm, while something inside me hardened. I had given them years of patience. Tonight, I would give them something else. When the session paused for a short break, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs against the floor was sharper than any words I could have spoken. A few heads turned, then quickly turned away. No one asked where I was going. No one ever did. I walked down the long hallway lined with portraits, painted faces of ancestors, stern and proud, each one framed in gold. They looked down at me as if to say, "You don't belong here." I didn't argue with them. I stepped outside instead, the cool air hitting my skin like clarity. By the time I reached my car, the decision was already made. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and let the silence surround me. For years I had been told my silence meant I was weak. Tonight, silence would mean power. I pulled my laptop from the bag at my side and opened it on the passenger seat. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the interior with a cold, steady light. My fingers moved with muscle memory, logging into the secure system I had built. Blue Harbor's backbone, the empire they didn't even know existed, all resting beneath my fingertips. Every account, every shell company, every trust line they had unknowingly leaned on, it was all here. They believed their empire was built on family legacy. The truth? It stood on my shoulders, on my work, on my sacrifice. I hovered over the command for just a moment. This wasn't revenge. This was recognition. A quiet declaration that I wasn't invisible, that I had never been invisible. One click. The first red tag appeared on my screen. Access revoked. Another flickered into place, funds frozen, line after line lit up like sparks catching fire. Credit cards, trust accounts, vehicle assets, all suspended in seconds. I leaned back in my seat, my breath slow and even. Out there, in the Quinlan estate, they were still sipping coffee and exchanging pleasantries, unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted. This was my storm. My phone buzzed almost instantly, a message from Valora. Dad says the SUV's fuel card isn't working. Do you know what's wrong? I didn't reply. I let the screen go dark, the message unanswered. They wanted me to be silent. I was finally giving them silence, just not the kind they expected. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years they had demanded my silence to keep their peace. Now my silence was pulling their peace apart, thread by thread. I sipped from a bottle of water I had left in the console, watching the dashboard glow. My hands were steady. My heart, strangely calm. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was release. The family thought I had walked out of that meeting defeated. They believed Kayla's betrayal had sealed my fate. But the truth was the opposite. I wasn't the ghost they had dismissed from the room. I was the architect dismantling their foundation, brick by brick, in the quiet they taught me to carry. I closed the laptop, slid it back into my bag, and rested my head against the seat. Through the windshield, the estate loomed in the distance, golden lights glowing against the night. They looked untouchable. But I knew better. Inside those walls, they were about to discover what it meant to build a kingdom on someone else's silence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel erased. I felt whole. By the time I drove away from the Quinlan estate, the night air felt different, lighter. For years I had carried the weight of their silence, the burden of being invisible in a family that only remembered me when they needed something. But tonight, the silence was theirs. The next morning, I sat on the balcony of my home with a cup of cinnamon coffee in my hands. My phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls, frantic texts, voicemails dripping with sudden urgency, Valora demanding explanations, Lucas asking for help with unexpected account errors, my father muttering something about confusion, even my mother, her voice soft as ever, pleading for a chance to sit down as family. But none of them spoke the words I had ached to hear for decades. We were wrong. We see you now. I didn't respond, not to the texts, not to the calls. Instead, I turned my phone face down and let the quiet hum of the city remind me that life goes on, even when the people you called family finally feel what you once felt, being cut off. And in that quiet, something unexpected rose inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, but peace. Because the truth is, I hadn't only been building an empire for myself, I had been building something bigger, something for those who, like me, had been erased in their own families. Within weeks, I launched a foundation, not with my name in gold, not with headlines proclaiming my glory, but quietly. Funding scholarships for daughters who had been told they were less, supporting women-led startups that were ignored, creating a space for the overlooked to be seen. The family that once ignored me tried to reach out again, even sent an invitation for restorative brunch. I shredded it without a second thought. Restoration wasn't theirs to offer anymore. One afternoon, I visited our old childhood home. It was boarded up, the lawn unkempt, the swing in the backyard rusted stiff. I touched the fence post I had painted at 9 years old, the blue still faint under the dirt, and I realized it was never the house that failed me. It was the people inside it. I turned and walked away without looking back. Days later, I stood in the gleaming lobby of a new incubator space, one I had secretly funded for young founders. On the wall, a plaque read, "Founded for the Uninvited." I watched a young woman, barely 27, walk into her first pitch meeting. She carried a folder like it weighed the world. I handed her a document, resources, connections, capital. She looked at me with disbelief. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. "Peace," I said, "the kind you don't have to ask permission for." That was when I finally understood. Family isn't always blood. Family is the people who remember your worth when there's no applause left, and that is the lesson I want to leave with you. If you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or erased by the very people who should have seen you first, please know this: your worth isn't defined by their blindness. Your silence doesn't make you small. It makes you strong enough to choose where your voice belongs. This is why I share my story. And if it has touched something in you, If it made you remember a time when you were left out but not broken, I invite you to join me here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your own story in the comments. Because every time we speak these truths aloud, we remind someone else they are not alone. These are not just family stories, they are survival stories. They are stories of rising from the shadows to stand in the light, and together, they are proof that erasure is not the end. I didn't lose a family that day, I lost an illusion, and in its place, I found myself.